Get comfortable. Find a good position. If you've got a blanket nearby, now's probably the time for it. Tonight we're spending a few hours in South Park, Colorado. Population, not very many, depending on how many people have died this week. If you've been here before, either as a regular viewer of the show or as someone who's fallen asleep to one of these videos in the past, you'll know what to expect. Slow, unhurried, lots of detail, lots of small tangents, the kind of conversation that goes wherever it wants to go without being in any particular rush to get anywhere. And if this is your first time here, welcome. You've picked a good night to visit. The topic tonight is one I've been genuinely looking forward to talking about, and I want to explain why before we get into it. South Park, if you know the show even vaguely, has a reputation for being chaotic, random, deliberately offensive. A show that makes things up as it goes along and doesn't care about internal consistency because caring about internal consistency would be too earnest a thing for South Park to do. But here's the thing, that reputation isn't quite right. South Park actually built a very specific set of rules for itself in its early years. Not rules anyone handed down to Trey Parker and Matt Stone, rules they made for themselves deliberately as part of what the show was supposed to be. The episodic format, the no continuity philosophy, the idea that you could mock anything and everything with equal ferocity and never take a side. The running gags that were supposed to stay running gags. The characters who were never supposed to grow or change or develop in any meaningful direction. These were intentional choices, design decisions. The show knew exactly what it was, and for years it stuck very closely to what it said it was. And then, slowly, in ways that were sometimes planned and sometimes absolutely not, it started breaking those rules, one at a time, and each break is its own little story about what the show was trying to do, what surprised even the people making it, and what happened when they decided that a rule they'd been following for years no longer served the story they were trying to tell. Now, I should say, this is a sleep video. We're not here to get worked up about anything. We're going to move through these stories at a relaxed pace. Some of them are funny, some are genuinely interesting, some are a bit sad, and none of them need to be dramatic. The show has been going for nearly 30 years. There's time, we don't have to rush, that's what tonight is. A long, unhurried walk through every time South Park looked at its own rulebook and decided, quietly or loudly, to tear a page out. So settle in. If you happen to drift off somewhere in the middle, I won't mind. I'll still be talking, I'll still be here. Let's start at the beginning. Before we can talk about the rules South Park broke, we have to spend some time with the rules themselves. Because they're not obvious if you only know the show at surface level, and understanding them makes everything that comes later land properly. South Park premiered on Comedy Central on the 13th of August, 1997. It was created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two friends from Colorado who had been messing around with animated short films for years before the show got picked up. The pilot episode was produced using actual physical construction paper and stop-motion photography. Real paper cutouts, moved frame by frame, which is why it took 3 months to make. Every episode after it was produced using computer animation engineered to mimic that same handmade, slightly jerky aesthetic. Same look, much faster to produce. And that production speed turned out to be the most important thing about the show. From season 4 onward, South Park operated on a 6-day production cycle, 6 days from the initial concept to the finished episode airing on television. Standard animated shows take roughly 8 to 9 months per episode. South Park was doing it in less than a week. That production model wasn't just a logistical detail, it was a philosophy. It meant the show could respond to things happening in the world almost in real time. It could write an episode about something in the news on Monday and have it on air by Wednesday. No other animated show could do that. And that speed became one of the core parts of what South Park was supposed to be. The first rule then, possibly the most important one, was the episodic format. Every episode would be self-contained. Whatever happened in an episode would be resolved by the end of that episode. Next week, the slate would be clean, characters would be back to normal, the town would be fine, the world would be reset. This wasn't laziness, it was a deliberate choice that kept the show nimble. If each episode had to build on the last, the writers would constantly be managing continuity, rather than reacting to whatever was happening in the world that week. The reset button was a feature, not a bug. The second rule was the cast. 4 boys at the center of everything. Stan Marsh, the reasonably sensible one. Kyle Broflovsky, the moral compass, who occasionally lost his mind trying to be the moral compass. Eric Cartman, the manipulative, self-serving, genuinely shocking one who the show used as a vehicle for every dark idea it wanted to explore. And Kenny McCormick, the poor kid in the orange parka who couldn't quite be understood when he spoke, and who, in those early years, died at least once per episode. The 4 boys were the show. Adults existed in their orbit as obstacles and idiots, occasionally as reluctant sources of wisdom. But the story always came back to the boys. The third rule, and this is the one Parker and Stone talked about most in interviews, was what I'd call the equal opportunity rule. South Park would mock everything and everyone. No belief system, no public figure, no political position would get special protection. The show's credibility depended on this. If it went after Republicans but left Democrats alone, it was partisan satire. If it went after Christianity but protected Islam, it was selective. The premise was that absolutely nothing was sacred, and that meant nothing. Every target got the same treatment, which as a position sounds simple. It turns out to be remarkably hard to maintain for 30 years. The fourth rule was simpler but just as load-bearing. Nobody grows, nobody changes. The characters don't develop across episodes. They don't learn lessons that carry over. Whatever arc happens in one episode is erased by the next. Cartman doesn't become a better person because of something he experienced 2 weeks ago. Stan's parents don't stay divorced. Kenny doesn't build toward anything. The show exists in a kind of permanent present tense, where each episode is the only episode that matters. Now, some of these rules got broken quietly and gradually, and some got broken loudly and intentionally, and a few got broken by accident, in ways that became canon whether the show intended it or not. And what I find interesting, genuinely interesting, not in a clickbait way, just in the way where something keeps turning over in your head, is how each break tells you something about where the show was at that particular moment, what Parker and Stone were thinking about, what the show needed, what the rules were no longer able to contain. That's where we're going tonight. One more thing worth mentioning before we move on. When South Park started, Parker and Stone were in their late 20s. They're in their mid-50s now. They've been making this show for more than half their lives. And when you spend that long doing something, your relationship to the rules you made for yourself at the beginning inevitably changes. The rules that served a show made by 2 guys in their late 20s aren't necessarily the right rules for 2 men in their 50s who've watched the world change around them several times over. Some of the rule breaking in later seasons makes more sense when you think about it through that lens. Not rebellion for rebellion's sake, just evolution. The slow, sometimes reluctant acknowledgement that the person you were when you started isn't quite the person you are now, and the thing you made should probably reflect that. It's also worth spending a moment on where those rules came from beyond the practical rationale. Parker and Stone were, in many ways, reacting against the animated shows that came before South Park. The Simpsons was already a decade old when South Park launched. Family Guy was about to arrive. The landscape of adult animation had certain conventions. Clever writing, consistent characters, the occasional heartfelt moment, and South Park was built partly in reaction to those conventions. The no continuity rule wasn't just practical, it was almost a statement. We're not going to do the thing where episodes build on each other. We're not going to have seasons with arcs and development. Every episode is self-contained and excessive and over when it's over, because that's what we are. That kind of rule setting as identity is interesting because it means the rules are load-bearing in a cultural sense. Breaking one isn't just a narrative choice, it's a statement about what the show is becoming relative to what it said it was. And most of the breaks we'll talk about tonight are accompanied by at least some acknowledgement of that, an awareness that something foundational is shifting even when the shift is the right one. There's also the production model to consider again for a moment. 6 days, that's the window, Thursday morning to Wednesday night. The discipline required to produce something like South Park in that time frame. An animated show with a full score, with post-production, with voice recording, with visual effects, is genuinely staggering. The documentary 6 Days to Air followed the production of a single episode in 2011, and the people who watched it came away with two impressions: deep respect for the technical achievement and mild alarm at the working conditions. 100-hour weeks were standard. The final episode was sometimes uplinked to Comedy Central with hours to spare, sometimes minutes. What the 6-day cycle enforced was a kind of creative ruthlessness. There was no time for second guessing. If an idea didn't work by Wednesday, it didn't get fixed. It got replaced. The culture of the show was about making decisions fast and committing to them completely. That culture is part of why the rules lasted as long as they did. When you're working that fast, rules are what keep you from having to make 100 small decisions every day. They're not constraints, they're infrastructure. And when you break them fast. There's no time in a week-long production for a drawn-out deliberation about whether a rule should change. You make the call, you execute, and you find out if you were right when the episode airs. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the most famous rule of all. Kenny McCormick has probably died more times than any other character in television history. I say probably because nobody has actually counted, which feels like a missed opportunity for someone with a spreadsheet and a lot of free time. But the number is somewhere in the hundreds across the show's run, which is remarkable when you say it out loud. A child character who has been killed hundreds of times in hundreds of different ways across nearly 3 decades of television. And for the first 5 seasons, that's roughly 1997 to 2001, this was entirely a gag. There was no mythology behind it. There was no explanation. Kenny died. Stan said, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny." Kyle said, "You bastards." And that was it. Next week, Kenny was alive again. Standing at the bus stop, back in school, nobody in South Park, except occasionally in the moment, seemed to notice or care that their small friend had been crushed by a speeding ambulance or eaten by a giant bird or spontaneously combusted while walking down the street. The gag was its own reward. The creativity of the deaths was part of it. The show's writers kept finding new and increasingly absurd ways to kill the same character. But the real joke, the deeper joke, was the indifference. The way the adults of South Park walked past a dead child on the pavement and continued about their business. The way Kenny's friends would cry out in horror on a Wednesday and have completely forgotten about it by Thursday. The whole thing was a commentary on television itself, on how cartoons can do anything and reset with no consequences, and on how audiences had learned not to be genuinely disturbed by anything that happens on screen. And then something happened that nobody was quite expecting. In season 5, Parker and Stone decided to actually kill Kenny, for real, permanently, or at least that's how they framed it. The episode is called Kenny Dies, and it aired in December 2001. Kenny is diagnosed with a terminal illness, specifically a condition called muscular hypertrophy, though the medical specifics are less important than the emotional texture of the episode. What matters is that for the first time, the show played Kenny's death without a punchline. His friends visited him in hospital. Stan, who couldn't cope with watching someone he cared about suffer, stayed away entirely and arrived too late. Kenny died in a hospital bed with Kyle and Cartman present, while Stan stood outside the room, unable to bring himself to go in. It was genuinely upsetting, not in a shocking way, in a quiet way. The kind of upsetting that sneaks up on you because you weren't expecting the show to ask you to feel something real. And then season 6 began, and Kenny simply wasn't in it. Tweak and Butters stepped in to fill the 4th spot in the group. The show ran the whole season without acknowledging what had happened, just continuing forward as though the orange parka had always been empty, which was its own kind of strange. Watching a show replace a character it had supposedly gotten rid of permanently, without addressing the replacement or the absence. Kenny came back quietly at the end of season 6, alive, with no explanation offered. The show moved on. For several seasons after that, the deaths continued but became less frequent. Less every episode, more occasional. The gag hadn't been abandoned, but it had changed shape. There's a particular episode from season 5 that's worth pausing on here, before Kenny's permanent death in that season. Best Friends Forever, which aired in season 9 actually, so slightly later, is an episode that put Kenny in a persistent vegetative state, and then ran a full parody of the Terry Schiavo case through the lens of whether Kenny's feeding tube should be removed. Cartman wanted it removed, claiming to be Kenny's best friend. Stan and Kyle wanted Kenny to live. The episode was timed to air during the peak of the real Schiavo controversy and landed with enough precision that it won the show an Emmy. What's interesting about that episode from a continuity perspective is that it took Kenny's situation seriously in a way the earlier deaths never had. It built an episode of real topical satire around the question of what happens to Kenny after he doesn't die in the usual cartoon way. His vegetative state wasn't a death. It was a different kind of consequence, one with legal and moral dimensions. The show wasn't ready to give Kenny a full mythology yet, but it was already finding that his character could carry more weight than the gag had required. There's also the quiet detail from that episode that Kenny had written a will, had prepared legal documents, had thought about his own death and its aftermath, which implies a level of self-awareness about his situation that the later Mysterion arc would flesh out completely. He knew on some level that dying was something he did. He had planned for it. That's not a throwaway gag. That's a character. The rule that Kenny always dies and nobody ever mentions it had been cracked open by the season 5 departure. And it would be cracked open much further a few years later by a superhero with a very specific and very tragic power. But that's the next section. And there's no rush. The Kenny story takes a stranger turn a few seasons later. And by stranger, I mean the kind of strange where you're watching a show that's been running for 14 seasons and you suddenly realize it's been quietly building something underneath the surface this whole time, in the spaces between the jokes, and you hadn't noticed until the moment it decides to show you. The Coon and Friends trilogy aired in season 14 in 2010. The premise is that the boys of South Park have formed a superhero team. Cartman is the Coon, Kenny is Mysterion, Kyle is Human Kite, and so on. Standard South Park absurdity. Children in homemade costumes pretending to have powers. Except Mysterion isn't pretending. Unlike the other boys, who are clearly just kids playing make-believe in varying levels of commitment, Kenny takes his identity as Mysterion with a seriousness that doesn't quite fit the tone of everything around him. He's grim about it in a way the others aren't, and the reason becomes clear when he explains, to his friends who don't believe him, that his superpower is that he cannot die. He has died multiple times. He always comes back. Nobody ever remembers it happened. His friends think he's exaggerating. So Kenny, standing right there in front of them in the middle of a conversation, takes out a gun and shoots himself in the head. The reaction from his friends is immediate and horrified. They're screaming. They're devastated. They don't know what to do. And the next morning, Kenny wakes up in his bed, alive and completely fine. He goes to school. His friends see him. Not a single one of them remembers what happened the night before. That scene, the reaction, the horror, and then the erasure, reframes every single Kenny death in the previous 13 seasons. Every moment that played as a throwaway gag. Every time Stan and Kyle said their lines and moved on. Every time a new episode started and Kenny was just there. None of that was carelessness on the show's part. Or rather, it was built on top of something real that the show had been sitting on for years and only now decided to show. The mythology goes further. Kenny confronts his parents about it, about why he keeps dying and coming back. And his parents confess to having attended a meeting for something called the Cult of Cthulhu. For those who don't know, Cthulhu is a creation of the American writer H.P. Lovecraft, a cosmic entity of incomprehensible scale, associated with madness and the dissolution of reality as humans understand it. The McCormicks had joined a cult dedicated to this creature, And the reason they joined? Free beer. That's it. Kenny's parents condemned their son to an eternity of dying and being reborn, an endless cycle of suffering and isolation, because there was free beer at the cult meeting. There's something about the sheer smallness of that reason against the enormity of the consequence that is so perfectly South Park, it almost circles back around to being profound. And then the final image of the trilogy. Kenny has died again, come back again, been forgotten again. He tells his friends, exhausted in a way that's completely distinct from how he usually carries himself, that he's tired and wants to go to bed. Then he shoots himself in the head again. His friends react with horror. They'll forget by morning. The show cuts to Kenny's house. His mother jolts awake in bed, grabbing her stomach. She screams that it's happening again. And then she places a newborn baby, dressed in a tiny orange parka, into a crib. She looks at her husband and says, with something that sounds genuinely like regret, that they never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting. I'll be honest, when I first watched that scene, I wasn't ready for it. I'd been watching South Park since I was too young to be watching South Park, and I'd always filed Kenny's deaths under running gag and moved on. That moment made me genuinely feel something, not a lot. It's still a cartoon that mostly involves fart jokes, but something. The kind of thing where you sit with it for a minute before reaching for the remote. What the Mysterion arc did, and what makes it one of the more remarkable creative moves the show ever made, is that it didn't require any of the earlier deaths to have been secretly intentional. The gag was a gag. And then the show grew up enough to look at the gag and ask, but what if it wasn't? What does it actually mean if this is real? And the answer it found, the loneliness, the isolation, the tragedy of suffering that nobody around you can perceive, is darker and more interesting than most dramas twice its size would attempt. There's a detail in the Coon and Friends trilogy that I think about occasionally. When Kenny as Mysterion tries to explain his situation to his friends, the deaths, the resurrections, the amnesia that erases everyone's memory, they don't believe him, not out of cruelty. They just can't process what he's describing. It falls outside the frame of what they understand to be possible, so they dismiss it, kindly but completely. And Kenny, who has been living with this for his entire life, has to absorb their disbelief and keep going anyway. That's a very specific kind of loneliness, the kind where the truth you're carrying can't be received by the people you'd most want to tell it to. Not because they don't care, but because the truth is too far outside their frame. It's the kind of loneliness that doesn't get better with company, because company requires some shared understanding of reality. And Kenny's reality is fundamentally private. The show handles this without being heavy-handed about it, which is the right choice. It's not trying to make a statement about isolation or invisible suffering or anything with a capital letter. It's just following the logic of the premise and finding that the logic leads somewhere genuinely sad. There's one more thing worth noting here. After the Coon and Friends trilogy, Kenny's deaths in later seasons carry a different weight for anyone who watched those episodes. The show hadn't made every death meaningful. Most remained quick and absurd. But the mythology is there now, underneath the gag, and you can feel it. The knowledge that this child has been through this hundreds of times and has to go through it again, alone, while his friends watch in horror and forget by morning. The joke is still a joke. It's also now something else. The rule that said Kenny dies and nobody remembers and it doesn't matter was already cracked from the Season 5 departure. The Mysterion arc didn't just crack it further, it recast the whole rule as the tragedy it had always kind of been, and dared the audience to look at it that way. South Park has one of the most immediately recognizable visual styles in television history. The flat paper cutout characters, the minimal movement, mouths opening and closing, arms occasionally waving, bodies barely rotating. The deliberately limited animation that started as a practical constraint and became over time an aesthetic identity. You know South Park from half a glance. There's nothing else that looks like it. The rule, then, the implicit rule that the show established through 20-odd seasons of consistent visual language, is that this is how South Park looks. This is the aesthetic. This is the contract between the show and the audience. You will always be watching something that looks like construction paper brought to life by computer animation. Unconventional by any professional standard, but consistent. And then Season 8, Episode 1 came along, and the rule went out the window. Not in a quiet way. In a way where you're watching the show and suddenly something completely different is on screen and your brain takes a second to catch up. Good Times with Weapons, which aired in 2004, begins normally enough. The boys find a weapons stand at a county fair selling genuine martial arts weapons, lie to the vendor about having parental permission, and walk away with nunchucks, seis, tonfis, and a shuriken. They start playing a game where they pretend to be ninjas. And the moment that imagination kicks in, the show's animation switches completely into something that looks like a stylized Japanese anime sequence. Letterbox format, the boys drawn as adult martial artists with dramatically different proportions, Japanese ambient music playing in the background. It's jarring and fantastic in equal measure. The switch happens mid-scene and is explained by absolutely nothing except the fact that this is how the boys imagine themselves. Then the fantasy ends and the show cuts back to normal South Park animation, showing the reality of what's actually happening, which is 4 children waving weapons around dangerously in a public space. The joke is partly in the contrast, the grandiosity of the anime sequences against the absurdity of what's actually occurring. But the visual rule break is real. The show genuinely produced extended segments in a completely different animation style and cut between them and its usual look as though this were a normal thing to do. Then Season 12 did something even more ambitious. Major Boobage is an episode about Kenny getting high by inhaling cat urine. Yes, really, and experiencing hallucinations. The hallucination sequences were produced using heavy rotoscoping that deliberately mimics the visual style of the 1981 animated film Heavy Metal. Deep colors, fluid movement, the specific dreamy unreality of that film's aesthetic. It's a style that has almost nothing in common with the flat, jerky South Park look. And the contrast between the two, cutting from the show's normal animation into these lush, almost painterly sequences, is doing something slightly more interesting than just a visual gag. There's something being said about the nature of escapism, about why the fantasy is more vivid than the reality. But I'll leave that one to your own interpretation. And then there's Make Love, Not Warcraft from Season 10, an episode set largely inside the World of Warcraft video game, filmed using machinima, actual footage captured within the game engine, cut together with the show's animated sequences. The boys' in-game characters are rendered in the Warcraft engine's visual style, moving through game environments, while the real-world scenes play in standard South Park animation. 2 completely different visual languages sharing the same episode, and the episode not only pulls it off but won an Emmy for it. And Woodland Critter Christmas from Season 8, which abandons the show's visual style in a different direction. A narrated fairy tale with storybook framing, a gentle voiceover describing events as they happen, the whole thing presented as a story being told rather than directly depicted. A completely different register, both visually and narratively, a rule break that isn't loud but is genuinely thorough. What I find interesting about all of these is that they're not accidents. They required time and deliberate production choices. Somebody in the room said, "For this episode, we're going to make something that doesn't look like our show." And everyone else agreed. The rule wasn't forgotten, it was consciously suspended for a specific reason and then reinstated afterward. And there's something worth saying about what happens to the viewer when the animation style changes. The South Park aesthetic is so consistent and so distinctive that a departure from it doesn't just register as unusual, it registers as meaningful. When the anime sequences in Good Times with Weapons kick in, you don't just see a different style. You understand immediately that what you're watching is the boys' inner world, their imagined version of themselves. The contrast between the sleek, powerful anime figures and the awkward reality of children waving weapons around in public spaces is the entire joke, and it only works because you know the show well enough to feel the gap. Major Boobage uses the same principle. The heavy metal style hallucination sequences are Kenny's interiority. The grandiose, lush, heavily sexualized fantasy world that the cat urine high generates in his imagination, cut against the flat, simple reality of Kenny sitting in his bedroom getting high, the visual contrast is the point. The animation style is doing narrative work. It's not decoration, it's information. And Make Love Not Warcraft takes a slightly different approach because the machinima sequences aren't fantasy. They're as real within the episode's world as the South Park animation. The boys are actually playing World of Warcraft. Their in-game characters are as real to them as their physical selves. The show treats both visual registers with equal seriousness, which creates a funny and slightly melancholy portrait of gaming as a genuine alternate reality rather than just escapism, which is maybe the most honest way to break a rule, not pretending it doesn't exist, just deciding for one episode that it doesn't apply. South Park built its reputation on a very particular emotional register, irreverence. Nothing was serious, nothing was sacred, everything that a more sensitive show might have handled carefully, South Park handled with deliberate crudeness. And the effect was that you couldn't quite accuse it of being cruel, because it was clearly just doing a bit. The cruelty was in on the joke. The darkness was always undercut by something ridiculous. The rule then, unwritten but deeply felt by anyone who watched the show, was that South Park doesn't ask you to feel things. Not really. It might surprise you, occasionally shock you, occasionally make you think. But it doesn't want your tears. Tears would be too sincere, and sincerity was the one thing South Park couldn't afford to be caught with. And then came Kenny Dies. I talked about this episode in the Kenny Rule section, but I want to spend more time with it here, because the emotional break it represented was its own thing, distinct from the continuity break of Kenny actually staying dead. The specific texture of that episode is what matters. Most of Kenny Dies is a fairly standard South Park story. Cartman discovers that embryonic stem cells can be used to grow Shakey's pizza ingredients, and spends the episode trying to manipulate the political climate around stem cell research for personal gain. This is textbook Cartman behavior, and it's funny in the usual way. But running alongside it is Stan's inability to visit Kenny in hospital, not played for laughs, not undercut with a joke, just a kid who loves his friend and can't face what's happening. The final scene has Stan arriving at the hospital after Kenny has already died. He sits on the floor outside the room. He doesn't go in. He's too late, and he knows it. The scene is quiet in a way South Park scenes almost never are. No punchline, no resolution, just the weight of having missed something you can't get back. It moved people. Critics who had been dismissive of the show found themselves writing seriously about it. And Parker and Stone, in interviews after the episode aired, seemed genuinely caught off guard by the response. They knew the episode was different. They hadn't quite anticipated how different people would find it. And here's a fun detail that makes the whole thing richer. Parker has said that he and Stone had been talking for years about how they actually liked Kenny as a character, that the deaths, which had started as a gag, had started to feel limiting. They didn't want Kenny to only exist as a punchline. Killing him off permanently was partly about freeing themselves from a running joke that had become a constraint. And Kenny Dies was their attempt to honor the character on the way out. He didn't stay out, of course. Kenny came back, but the fact that the show tried to give him a proper farewell and that the farewell was emotionally sincere is its own kind of rule break. The show that didn't want your tears asked for them quietly in a hospital corridor. Later seasons would push further in this direction. The Mysterion arc, which I've already talked about, layered genuine pathos onto the character. The episode, The Poor Kid, explored Kenny's home life with a directness the show had mostly avoided. and there would be other moments throughout the show's run, not many, but enough, where the emotional rule got suspended and the show allowed itself to mean something for a few minutes. There's also the small, quiet moment of Raisins in Season 7, where Stan's first real heartbreak, Wendy breaking up with him, sends him into a depression that the show treats with genuine gentleness. He joins the goth kids, he sits in the rain, his friends try to help and mostly fail. Kyle's attempts to cheer him up are sweet and useless in the way that most well-intentioned comfort is. The episode doesn't resolve Stan's sadness with a joke. It just lets him be sad for a while and trusts that the audience will stay with it. These moments don't define the show. The show is still mostly irreverent, mostly crude, mostly about the comedy of human stupidity. But they exist, and they're better than they need to be. And the fact that a show built on deliberate emotional insulation occasionally lowers its guard is, I think, part of why it's lasted as long as it has. No notes on those moments. The show earned them. Most of the rule breaks in this video are things Parker and Stone chose. Either they decided a rule no longer served the show, or they found something more interesting waiting on the other side of it, or the story they were trying to tell required them to go somewhere the rule wouldn't allow. Intentional breaks, deliberate choices. Chef is different. Isaac Hayes voiced Chef from the show's very first episode. He was the school cafeteria cook, a warm, soulful, good-natured man whose primary character note, across 9 seasons, was that he was the only adult in South Park who consistently gave good advice. Every other adult was either an idiot, a hypocrite, or both. Chef was the exception. He was the one who would actually sit with the boys, take their problems seriously, and try to help. He was also given the show's funniest running gag, a tendency to respond to almost any situation with a soul song that was some variation on the theme of sexual activity, sung with complete sincerity and impeccable musicality. Hayes was not just a voice actor, he was a legitimate musical legend. The man who wrote Hold On, I'm Comin', and Soul Man, one of the defining figures in American soul and R&B. Having him do the show was a genuine creative coup. And the warmth he brought to the character was real. You could hear it. Chef felt like a person rather than a cartoon, and a lot of that was Hayes. The rule then, and it was never written down, but it was absolutely there in the show's DNA, was that Chef stayed. He was permanent. He was the one reliable adult. He was the heart. And then, in 2006, Isaac Hayes quit. He was a Scientologist, and Season 9 had featured Trapped in the Closet, an episode that extensively and quite viciously parodied Scientology, depicting Tom Cruise literally refusing to come out of a closet and satirizing the church's beliefs in considerable detail. Hayes had not objected to previous South Park episodes mocking Christianity, Islam, or any other religion. But Scientology was personal, and he left. Parker and Stone's public statement at the time was pointed. They noted that Hayes had been fine with the show attacking every other religion and belief system for 9 years, and suggested that his objection to Scientology being treated the same way was a double standard. They didn't try to get him back, they wrote him out. Return of Chef aired as the Season 10 premiere. It used audio spliced from Hayes' previous recordings to construct a version of the character who had joined a cult called the Super Adventure Club, and who was behaving erratically and saying disturbing things. The show was transparent about what it was doing. It wasn't a graceful farewell, it was a slightly cruel, slightly funny, genuinely strange piece of television that acknowledged the behind-the-scenes situation while also delivering a version of justice that felt more like grievance than tribute. Chef died at the end of the episode, killed by a mountain lion and then a grizzly bear, and then defecated on for good measure. The boys mourned him. Kyle gave a speech about blaming the brainwashing cult that had stolen their friend rather than the man himself. And then the show moved on. What it lost, when it lost Chef, the actual warmth of that character, the sense of a reliable, good adult at the center of things, never quite got replaced. The show tried various configurations, Mr. Garrison, who had been a recurring teacher character, took on more prominence. Randy Marsh expanded his role. But nobody filled the specific space that Chef had occupied, and I think the show knew it. There's a reason the boys still occasionally reference him years after his departure. He mattered. The rule wasn't something anyone chose. It was something that happened to the show, and the show handled it with a mix of wit and bitterness that felt honest, even if it wasn't kind. Sometimes the rules break not because you decide they should, but because something outside your control removes the thing the rule was built around. I'll be honest about something here. I've watched Return of Chef a few times, and I find it genuinely hard to settle on how I feel about it. On one level, it's exactly what South Park would do. Confrontational, unwilling to handle something sensitively when it could handle it provocatively. On another level, there's a cruelty in it that's different from the show's usual cruelty, because Hayes wasn't a fictional character. He was a real person, a person who had contributed to the show for 9 seasons, who quit for reasons he believed in, even if you think he was inconsistent about applying them. Using his archived audio to put words in his mouth one last time feels like a different kind of thing than parodying a celebrity or institution. The show's defenders would say that Hayes opened himself to this by abandoning a consistent principle. Maybe. The episode's closing speech, the one where Kyle says to blame the cult that brainwashed their friend rather than blaming the man himself, is an attempt at something like grace. It acknowledges that the person and the decision can be separated. It doesn't demand the audience hate Isaac Hayes. It just closes the door on Chef and moves on. And the door does close. Chef doesn't come back, and the show doesn't really try to replace him. Later seasons have various adult figures, teachers, parents, other community members, who occasionally step into the advisory role. But none of them fill it the same way. Chef was specific. The warmth was specific. The musicality was specific. When you lose something irreplaceable, you find out it was irreplaceable by discovering how many things don't fit the shape it left behind. Here's the thing about the reset button. It's not just a narrative convenience. It's a philosophy. The idea that nothing sticks, that whatever chaos happens in any given episode will be resolved and forgotten by the next, is a statement about the nature of South Park as a place. It can absorb anything. It always returns to baseline. The town is, in some sense, indestructible. Not because nothing bad happens, but because the collective memory of South Park is approximately 1 episode long. This reset button made the show flexible. It kept it light, even when dealing with dark material. It was part of what allowed Parker and Stone to go anywhere and do anything because the consequences never had to be carried. Write an episode where the whole town gets destroyed? Fine. It'll be rebuilt by next week, or the rubble just won't be mentioned. Write an episode where Cartman does something monstrous? Fine. He'll be back to his usual self next time, with no one holding him accountable for what happened. The rule was, the slate clears, always. Whatever happened, happened in that episode, and that episode only. For 14 seasons, this held. There were cracks, moments that carried over slightly, continuity errors that implied previous events were remembered, a handful of two-parters that required memory of the first part to understand the second. But the baseline always reasserted itself. The reset always happened. And then You're Getting Old aired in June 2011, and the rule didn't just bend. It stayed broken for the rest of the episode and most of the next one. Stan Marsh turns 10 in this episode. His 10th birthday, which is notable in itself since he's been 9 or 10 for the entire run of the show, and here the show is actually marking it as an event. Stan begins to experience something that the episode depicts visually as a kind of perceptual shift. Everything starts to look and sound like excrement to him. Movies look like sewage. Music sounds like someone defecating. The world has, in Stan's eyes, become a parade of rubbish dressed up as things worth caring about. The show plays this partly for gross-out comedy. The actual audio of popular songs replaced with flatulent sounds film trailers for imaginary movies that end with "rated R for this movie looks like shit, fuck you." But the emotional core of it is something else. Stan is experiencing a kind of depression that the show is careful not to oversimplify. His friends start to avoid him. His relationship with Kyle quietly fractures. His parents' marriage, which had reset from divorce back to functioning normalcy several times over the years, finally stops resetting. The episode ends with Randy and Sharon sitting down and having a genuinely quiet, genuinely sad conversation about how long they've been unhappy. Sharon says something that is both the episode's funniest line and its most pointed observation, that the same things keep happening every week, over and over, and nothing ever really changes. Randy agrees. They're going to separate, and then Fleetwood Mac's Landslide starts playing. What follows is a montage of Stan's life shifting around him, his parents packing, the house being sold, Stan moving into a new home with his mother. His friendship with Kyle gone, replaced by a new and deeply uncomfortable dynamic where Kyle is now spending time with Cartman. Stan sitting alone, no punchline, no reset, no resolution. The episode ends in the most authentic, emotional place South Park had ever allowed itself to reach. And it stays there. Time magazine put it at number 7 in its list of the top 10 television episodes of the year. The reviewer, James Poniwozik, wrote that it moved him to tears. He called the dialogue between the Marshes stunningly genuine and described the episode as simultaneously the most juvenile and the most mature South Park had ever produced. Parker and Stone, on the DVD commentary for the follow-up episode Asperger's, admitted they went into the writer's room for the second half of the story without a plan. The first question someone asked was, "Now what the hell do we do?" The reset, which had always been automatic, suddenly felt impossible. You can't just undo something that landed that hard. Asperger's found a kind of resolution. Stan's depression is misdiagnosed as a flu shot-induced syndrome. His world gradually reassembles. His friendship with Kyle resumes. The reset button is technically pressed, but it doesn't quite erase what the previous episode did. The final shot of Stan taking a swig of whiskey to get through the day is not a happy ending. It's a show acknowledging that it broke something and it can't entirely fix it, and isn't going to pretend otherwise. That whiskey swig gets talked about a lot by South Park fans. I think it gets talked about because it's the show admitting, without being overly dramatic about it, that some resets are incomplete. Some things leave a mark. And the same shit every week that Sharon described as the problem, the endless repetition of the reset, was something the show was no longer willing to pretend was fine. The reset button still existed after this. The show still mostly cleared its slate between episodes, but you could see the seams in it from this point forward, the machinery behind the curtain. And once you've seen that, you can't quite unsee it. There's a broader point worth making here about what the reset button was actually protecting. It wasn't just a narrative convenience. The reset was, in a sense, a way of saying, this show is not about consequences, it's about observation. South Park watches the world and comments on it. It doesn't live in the world it depicts, because living there would mean carrying the weight of everything that happens. The reset kept the show light enough to keep moving, episode by episode, week by week, without accumulating the kind of emotional baggage that would eventually make it impossible to be funny about anything. You're Getting Old didn't destroy that protection. It just acknowledged that the protection had a cost. That a character who genuinely mattered to the people making the show, Stan, who Parker has spoken about as the character closest to himself, couldn't stay permanently 10 years old and permanently unaffected by time without something eventually pressing through the surface. The cynicism Stan develops in that episode, the way everything starts to look like rubbish to him, is a very specific kind of adult experience. The experience of having been genuinely enthusiastic about the world and then watching that enthusiasm slowly erode. Parker was 41 when that episode aired. Stone had just turned 40. The reset button exists in that episode, but it's covered in damage. It pressed. things mostly went back, but not quite all the way. And the small distance between the previous normal and the new normal is the most honest thing the show has ever done with continuity. This one's a gentler entry, and I think that's probably welcome at this point in the evening. We've been through some heavy territory. Let's slow right down and talk about the South Park theme song. The theme, for those who need reminding, and there's no shame if you don't have it memorized, is that distinctive, slightly chaotic piece of music performed by Primus, written by the band's bassist Les Claypool. Tempo around 144 beats per minute, 4/4 time, the boys singing along in a call and response pattern while the opening titles roll. It's immediately recognizable. It feels like it's always been there. It hasn't quite, or rather it's changed more times than most people realize. The very original version, the version that played over the unaired pilot before the show was broadcast publicly, was significantly slower. When the series got picked up, the tempo was sped up for the broadcast version. Small change, but it's there if you go looking. Then the boys' vocals were re-recorded at a higher pitch during season 3, because the original recordings were starting to sound too old. The actors' voices had subtly changed, and the show wanted the theme to sound like children rather than slightly older children. That re-recording happened quietly, and most viewers never noticed. The first major change came mid-season 4, when the original theme was replaced with something completely different. A techno and breakbeat remix by a producer called Paul Robb, replacing the Primus acoustic guitars with synthesizers and a driving electronic rhythm. It was called the 4th grade theme, coinciding with the boys being promoted from 3rd to 4th grade, and it sounded nothing like what came before it. It ran for a few episodes, then disappeared. Then came the bluegrass theme, which ran from season 6 through 10. A twangy, country-influenced version of the same melody, slower, more relaxed, with an almost Western Colorado feel to it. And here's a detail I find quietly lovely. During season 6, when Kenny was canonically dead and had been replaced in the group by Timmy Birch, Kenny's vocal part in the theme song was temporarily reassigned to Timmy, who, being Timmy, just said Timmy in the rhythm where Kenny's line used to go. Genuinely charming and genuinely strange. From season 10 onward, the current version, the Wamola theme, took over. A rock and metal remix featuring Les Claypool playing a custom instrument called a Wamola, a kind of electrified one-stringed bass. It's louder and harder edged than previous versions, and it's the one most people associate with the show if they started watching in the mid to late 2000s. Season 17 brought the 3D animated opening, replacing the flat animation title sequence with a 3-dimensional version of the same imagery, same music, different visual approach. And then season 25, which was notable for a number of reasons, included a new orchestral arrangement of the theme, full orchestra, re-recorded, and meaningfully, it restored Kenny's original uncensored lyrics, which had been cleaned up in earlier versions. A small restoration of something that had been quietly changed years before. What I find charming about all of this is how thoroughly the show changed something that most viewers assume was always the same. The South Park theme feels like an institution. It feels permanent and unchanging. But it's actually been in quiet revision for most of the show's run, with Parker and Stone or Claypool adjusting it to reflect whatever the show was at that particular moment. The bluegrass version feels like a slightly gentler show. The Wamola version feels like a show with harder edges. The orchestral version feels like a show aware of its own history. Rules about identity are funny that way. The thing that feels most fixed is sometimes the thing that's changed the most. And talking about the theme brings up one more detail that I think is worth including here. The Kenny problem in the bluegrass version. When Kenny was canonically dead in season 6 and his replacement Butters had taken his spot in the group, the show faced a question about the theme song lyrics. Kenny's line in the call and response had always been muffled and barely intelligible, which was part of the joke. But with Kenny absent, that line couldn't remain his, so it was reassigned to Timmy Birch, who had become a supporting character around that time. Timmy Birch, for those who might not remember, is a character with a developmental disability whose verbal vocabulary consists almost entirely of his own name. He shouts Timmy with great enthusiasm on most occasions. So in the bluegrass theme version during season 6, the section of the song that was Kenny's became simply Timmy. Delivered with complete commitment, in the rhythm of the original, in the context of a theme song that everyone watching would have known had once said something else. It's a small thing, but it's also quietly the show, acknowledging the rule break in the most low-key way possible. The theme was never supposed to change, the cast was never supposed to change, but Kenny was gone, and the show found a way to mark that absence in the song itself without making a big deal about it. Just adjusted the line, moved on, waited for Kenny to come back. The song changed, the show continued. Both things happened simultaneously without fuss. There's something I find genuinely appealing about the orchestral arrangement from season 25. Re-recording the theme with a full orchestra more than 25 years into the show's run is an odd thing to do. Most shows don't refresh their theme songs that deeply, that late. But there's something almost like a statement in it. An acknowledgement of the show's own longevity, a willingness to dress up something that had always been deliberately rough around the edges in something that sounds, for once, genuinely grand. Whether that was the intent or whether it just felt like a good idea at the time, I couldn't tell you. But it lands differently than any other version of the theme. It sounds like a show that's been going a while and knows it. Now we're getting into heavier territory again. Get comfortable. South Park's founding claim, the one Parker and Stone articulated in countless interviews and defended over many years, was that the show was an equal opportunity offender. It satirized everything. No belief, no religion, no public figure, no political position got special treatment. Christianity got mocked. Judaism got mocked. Islam got mocked. Buddhism got mocked. Every major religion, every political party, every celebrity, every cultural institution was fair game. The rule wasn't just a creative preference, it was a moral position. Consistency meant credibility. If you protected one target, you invalidated everything else. This rule held mostly for a very long time. Super Best Friends in season 5 depicted Muhammad as a character, openly, without incident, which is remarkable to think about now, given what came later. Cartoon Wars in season 10 built an entire two-parter around the debate over whether Family Guy should be allowed to show Muhammad on screen. And that episode ended with South Park deliberately not showing him, which felt at the time like a creative choice rather than a capitulation. Then came 200 and 201 in season 14. And things got complicated. The episodes involved 200 celebrity characters, everyone the show had ever mocked, suing the town of South Park in a class action lawsuit. The premise allowed Parker and Stone to revisit essentially every major target the show had ever taken on. And Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was at the center of the plot. Various characters needed his image, specifically his ability to not be depicted without causing controversy. And the show built a story around the absurdity of that cultural reality. Comedy Central asked Parker and Stone to censor the depictions of Muhammad. The creators complied reluctantly, with the character appearing in a bear costume through most of both episodes. When 201 aired, the censorship went further than Parker and Stone had approved. Dialogue was bleeped in ways they hadn't sanctioned. The episode's final speech, which addressed the whole controversy directly, was almost entirely bleeped out, rendering it incoherent. Parker and Stone issued a public statement saying that Comedy Central's decision had cut off what they were trying to say. They were, to put it mildly, not happy. Both episodes were pulled from the Comedy Central website and from syndication shortly after airing. They remain pulled. If you want to watch them, you can't find them through official channels. The episodes that triggered the censorship: Cartoon Wars from Season 10 and Super Best Friends from Season 5, which depicted Muhammad before any of this became an issue, were also removed from streaming out of an abundance of caution. What's worth sitting with from the rule-breaking angle is that the equal opportunity rule wasn't broken by Parker and Stone. They maintained it. They treated Muhammad the same way they treated everyone else, with irreverence, without protection. The rule was broken by the circumstances around the show, by the real-world context, by the fact that depicting one specific figure carried a threat of violence that depicting others didn't, and that a television network decided that wasn't a risk it was willing to take. The show had built its identity on the premise that no target was different from any other. And then reality demonstrated that some targets are different, not because of anything the show did, but because of what existed outside the show. Parker and Stone have never entirely gotten over this, I think. The 200 and 201 controversy sits in the show's history as the moment the equal opportunity principle was shown to have limits. Not because the creators abandoned it, but because the world around them enforced limits the show hadn't chosen. That's a different kind of break from most of the others in this video, and it's worth sitting with. There's a longer history here that's worth tracing because the Muhammad situation didn't come from nowhere. Super Best Friends in Season 5, which aired in 2001 before the controversy had escalated, depicted Muhammad openly as a member of a superhero team alongside Jesus, Moses, Buddha, and other religious figures. The episode attracted essentially no controversy at the time. It ran normally, reran normally, was available on the show's website. Nobody made a particular fuss. By the time Cartoon Wars aired in 2006, the context had changed. The Danish cartoon controversy of that year, in which political cartoons depicting Muhammad in a Danish newspaper triggered widespread protests and violence, had made the issue suddenly and sharply real. Cartoon Wars was South Park's direct response, and the episode's conclusion, where the show chooses not to show Muhammad despite arguing throughout that it should be allowed to, was Parker and Stone's acknowledgement that the context mattered, even if the principle didn't change. And then 200 and 201 pushed the whole thing to the point where the network couldn't absorb it. The real-world threat of violence against the production wasn't hypothetical. An extremist group had posted what amounted to a threat online in response to the episodes. Comedy Central's decision to over-censor the episodes was made, at least in part, with the physical safety of the people who worked on the show in mind. None of which makes the equal opportunity rule less important, but it does illustrate something true about rules made in the abstract. They encounter the world eventually, and the world doesn't always cooperate. The rule said every target gets the same treatment. The world said that some targets come with different costs. And the show found itself caught between a principle it believed in and a reality it couldn't fully control. That's not a story about hypocrisy. It's a story about limits. Every principle has them. One more thing about the Muhammad situation before we move on. The 2 episodes remain unavailable on official streaming platforms and in syndication. 200 and 201 exist in an unusual limbo for South Park material. The show is otherwise remarkably accessible, with most of its run available through official channels. Those 2 episodes are conspicuously absent. If you want to watch them, you can find them through unofficial means, but they are not something Comedy Central or Paramount Plus will surface for you. Parker and Stone have spoken about this with varying degrees of frustration over the years. They haven't sued to get the episodes reinstated. They've accepted the network's decision, however reluctantly. But the situation sits in the show's history as a permanent reminder that some decisions about what South Park can and cannot do are made by people other than its creators. The rule that said everything was fair game was always, technically, a rule the show could only hold as long as the network and the world around it allowed. That's an uncomfortable truth for a show that built its identity on fearlessness. Most of the time, South Park's fearlessness is real. In this case, it ran into something larger than it. And the show has lived with that honestly, without pretending the compromise didn't happen. Randy Marsh first appears in Season 1, Episode 1. He's Stan's father, a geologist, a slightly bumbling middle-class Colorado dad. He's in the background, supporting character, comic foil when the story needs one. He does something stupid every few episodes, perfectly serviceable minor character. And then, over the course of 15 years, he became the show. This didn't happen in one moment. It was a slow drift, almost impossible to pinpoint. Somewhere around Season 5 or 6, Randy started getting bigger plots. His stupidity became more elaborate, more committed, more specifically funny. He started feeling like more than just Stan's background dad. He had opinions, he had habits, he had a specific quality that the show found increasingly useful. The ability to be completely wrong about everything while remaining utterly convinced he was right, which is one of South Park's favorite targets and one that Randy embodied better than almost any other character. There's Randy shouting a racial slur on Wheel of Fortune in Season 11 in the episode with apologies to Jesse Jackson, which actually begins the episode's plot. There's Randy becoming obsessed with various fads, Guitar Hero, food, MMA, whatever the season demanded. There's Randy discovering in Season 18 that he's been living a double life as the pop singer Lord. And then Season 21 introduced Integrity Farms. Randy, for reasons that are both very Season 21 South Park and also surprisingly personal, decides to move the family to a farm in rural Colorado and grow marijuana. The marijuana farm becomes the primary storyline of Seasons 21, 22, and 23. Randy's obsession with the farm, his relationships with his business partners, his conflicts with rivals, all of it starts taking up the kind of screen time that Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny used to occupy. By the time critics and fans were writing about Season 23, a number of them observed, not always approvingly, that Randy had become the show's de facto main character. The boys were still there, still getting their plots, but the Randy at Integrity Farms storyline had the weight of the show behind it in a way that the boys' plots sometimes didn't. The rule that said the four boys were the center of South Park wasn't declared obsolete. It just slowly, quietly became less true than it had been. Randy Marsh, supporting character, had grown into something else, and the show had let him because he was genuinely funny in ways that kept evolving, and because Parker and Stone appeared to find in him a useful vessel for the particular kind of satire they wanted to do in the show's later years. There's a thing I find interesting about this, which is that Randy is essentially a character about middle-aged male self-delusion. His plots are almost always about an adult man convincing himself that he's doing something good or worthwhile when he clearly isn't. And the comedy comes from the gap between his self-image and reality. That gap gets funnier and more recognizable as the people making the show get older. The boys are fixed at age 10. Randy can age with the show's creators, or at least reflect the concerns of people who are no longer 30. Not a coincidence, I think, that he became more prominent as Parker and Stone moved into their 40s and 50s. There's also a practical reason the Randy shift happened when it did. South Park's satirical targets had changed over the decades. In the early years, the show mostly targeted specific events, celebrities, and trends, things that were in the news that week, processed through the lens of four children trying to make sense of them. By the late 2000s and 10s, the things Parker and Stone most wanted to satirize weren't individual events, but entire cultural attitudes. The way adults in modern America engage with identity, with commerce, with political tribe, with the idea of themselves as good people. Those targets needed a grown-up protagonist. The boys couldn't carry that satire because they're 10. Their perspective is fundamentally limited to childhood-scale concerns, however absurdly those concerns escalate. Randy could carry it. Randy was made of that material. The Integrity Farms arc in particular is a fairly sustained piece of satire about the American male tendency to wrap self-interest in the language of authenticity and values. Randy tells himself, and anyone who will listen, that he's growing marijuana because it's about integrity. about doing something real with your hands, about getting back to the land. The gap between the self-narrative and the reality that he's a businessman running a profitable enterprise while rationalizing his choices in the most self-congratulatory terms possible is the comedy. And it only works because Randy is an adult and because the show has 20-plus seasons of Randy's self-deceptions to draw on. Whether you find the Tegrity era the show at its best or the show slightly adrift depends on how much you came to South Park for the boys and how much for the satire. I've heard both positions argued convincingly. What I'd say is that the Randy shift was probably inevitable once Parker and Stone started finding their best material in adult experience rather than childhood experience. The show followed the writing as it usually does. For most of its first 10 seasons, South Park was aggressively episodic. The self-contained story was the form, not just a preference, a production philosophy built into the weekly schedule, which required starting from scratch each week and couldn't easily carry the weight of ongoing plot threads. You make something complete in 6 days, you air it, and then you make something else. That's the process. The process doesn't leave much room for. And meanwhile, last week's story is still unresolved. The first real cracks appeared with multi-part episodes. Cartoon Wars in Season 10 was a 2-parter. But even then, the 2 episodes were designed to work independently. The Imagination Land trilogy in Season 11 was more ambitious. 3 episodes that genuinely required watching in order, with a continuous plot and real stakes that carried from episode to episode. It was unusual enough to get a theatrical release as Imagination Land, the movie. The show had made something that felt more like a limited series than an episode of television. The Coon and Friends trilogy in Season 14 did the same thing and was notable for introducing the Mysterion mythology in a way that only made sense across multiple episodes. Then 200 and 201 in the same season. Then the Pandemic 2-parter. The show was building a habit of telling stories that didn't fit in 22 minutes. Season 18 introduced what Parker and Stone called light serialization. Threads that would carry across an entire season, not tying episodes together plot for plot, but giving the season a connective tissue that earlier seasons had deliberately avoided. Randy as Lord was the main arc. It was flexible enough that you could watch an individual episode without knowing what came before, but rewarding if you'd followed along. Then Season 19 went fully serialized. The PC Principal arc ran through the whole season, every episode connected, and it worked. Season 19 is well regarded, the satire was pointed, and the serialized format let the show develop ideas across a longer runway than 22 minutes normally allows. And then Season 20 happened. Season 20 is the most heavily serialized season South Park ever produced. A single continuous 10-episode story about internet trolling, online harassment, the 2016 US presidential election, and the member berries. Every episode fed into the next, subplots accumulated, characters' relationships evolved week by week. It was also the season when Donald Trump unexpectedly won the election. Parker and Stone had built their satire around a season-long arc in which Mr. Garrison, running as a Trump analog, would lose. When the real outcome came in, the whole season had to be reconsidered mid-production. The careful structure they'd built for 10 episodes was no longer tracking the reality they were supposed to be satirizing in real time. The finale is called The End of Serialization as We Know It. That title was Parker and Stone being completely transparent. They were done with it. The experiment had run into a wall. The episode wrapped the arc messily, and by Season 21, the show had returned to a largely episodic format. What's notable is that Parker and Stone didn't pretend the serialized format hadn't worked. They acknowledged it had its uses and its pleasures, but they discovered something the show's original design had instinctively known. A show that needs to comment on the world in real time can't afford to be locked into story commitments made weeks in advance. The episodic format wasn't a limitation. It was what made South Park South Park. The season 20 post-mortem is worth dwelling on because Parker and Stone were fairly candid about it. The problem wasn't that they did a serialized season. The problem was that real life refused to follow the plot. They had planned an arc where Mr. Garrison as Trump would eventually lose and fade away. And the satirical point of the season would be about the hollowness of that kind of political theater. Trump's actual election victory didn't just change the ending of their arc, it made their entire satire potentially complicit in the normalization of something they've been treating as an obvious joke. There's an episode late in season 20 where Parker and Stone are visibly improvising around a reality that has overtaken their planning. The jokes land differently. The certainty of the satire, which South Park at its best carries with the confidence of a show that has figured something out, feels absent. They're trying to find the right angle on something that keeps moving. The serialized format, which had felt innovative a few weeks earlier, suddenly felt like a cage. The show couldn't pivot. The episodes had already set up what would come next, and what they'd planned was wrong. The retreat to episodic after season 20 was fast and real. Season 21 felt genuinely liberated by comparison. Lighter on its feet, more willing to drop a subject when it had said its piece and pick up something new the following week. The freedom of not owing the audience a resolution felt like relief. The rule about no serialization was right for a reason. The show had to break it to fully understand. Not all rules are like that. This one was. There's also a smaller, gentler example of serialization that often gets overlooked in the bigger conversation about seasons 19 and 20. Season 18, the season Parker and Stone described as light serialization, had a thread that ran through the whole season without ever becoming a full plot. The mystery of who was singing as Lord. Various characters would encounter Lord's music, discuss Lord, admire Lord, and the audience, paying close attention, would slowly accumulate the evidence that it was Randy. The reveal came at the season finale, but the journey was the season itself. A slow burn that rewarded sustained watching rather than demanding it. That version of serialization, the kind where watching closely adds something but watching casually is still perfectly fine, is probably the right model for a show like South Park. Not a tightly constructed arc that requires weekly attention, but a gentle running thread that pays off for the devoted viewer without penalizing the casual one. Season 18 found that balance better than any other season. The experiments before and after it either didn't go far enough, earlier seasons, or went too far, season 20. Season 18 was the sweet spot. Parker and Stone have said in interviews that they were prouder of season 18 than almost any other season, which makes sense when you look at it through this lens. They found a way to do the thing serialization can do, build emotional resonance over time, reward loyalty, create a payoff that means more because of the journey, without giving up the thing episodic format can do, which is respond to the world with speed and freedom. Getting both at once in a single season is genuinely difficult. It doesn't happen often. South Park, as I mentioned earlier, built its credibility on not taking sides. Both sidesing wasn't a failure mode for the show. It was the point. Mock everyone, trust nobody. If you find yourself agreeing with one group, check yourself, because that probably means you're being taken for a ride. ManBearPig was introduced in Season 10, Episode 6 in 2006. Al Gore, the former vice president, appears in South Park and insists that the town is in danger from a terrible creature called ManBearPig, half man, half bear, half pig. The boys go along with him reluctantly. No ManBearPig is ever encountered. The episode plays entirely as a parody of Gore and climate alarmism, with Gore as a self-promoting idiot convinced of a threat that simply doesn't exist. The message was fairly unsubtle. Environmental panic is overblown, and the people promoting it are doing so for self-interested reasons. A lot of South Park's audience took that and ran with it. The show agreed with them, they figured. For 12 years, ManBearPig remained exactly that, a joke at Gore's expense, a symbol of climate hysteria. The show revisited the character a few times in the intervening years, always in the same register. And then season 22 aired in 2018. ManBearPig came back. And this time it was absolutely real. It was causing genuine destruction. People were dying. The town of South Park had to actually reckon with the creature that had been dismissed as a figment of Gore's imagination for over a decade. And eventually, in one of the more pointed reversals the show has ever produced, the boys had to formally apologize to Al Gore. They had been wrong. He had been right. ManBearPig was real. It had always been real. And their dismissal of the warning had made things worse. The show picked a side, clearly, without ambiguity. Climate change is real. The people who dismissed it were wrong. And apologizing for that dismissal is the right thing to do. Now, is this the show fully abandoning the equal opportunity philosophy? I'd argue it's more complicated than that. The episode still mocks the form of the apology, the performative quality of public mea culpas, the way people accept apologies as social lubricant rather than genuine reckonings. The satire hasn't entirely disappeared, but the position on the underlying issue, whether ManBearPig exists, whether the threat is real, is unambiguous. The show took the side of reality, which is honestly a reasonable position for any show to end up at after 12 years of evidence. And it says something interesting about the equal opportunity rule, that it was always slightly in tension with the show's other commitment, which was to honesty about what's actually true. It's also worth saying that the ManBearPig return in season 22 was done with some care. The episode doesn't abandon the comedy. It doesn't become a climate change PSA or a solemn reckoning. It keeps the absurdity. ManBearPig is still a physically ridiculous creature, and the town's response to its attacks involves all the usual South Park chaos. But the satire has shifted. It's no longer about the overblown claims of climate scientists. It's about the people who heard those claims, dismissed them as exaggerated, and are now dealing with consequences they could have avoided. There's a version of that story that would make the apology to Gore feel like the show lecturing its audience. Parker and Stone are smart enough to avoid that. The apology is awkward and uncomfortable, and the boys do it badly in the way that real apologies often are. Not because the show is excusing the dismissiveness, but because it's honest about how hard it is to admit you were wrong, especially when you were wrong for years, publicly in ways that felt clever at the time. I find I have more respect for that than I'd have for a clean reversal. A show that says we got this wrong, and here's an awkward, imperfect acknowledgement of that is being more honest than a show that quietly rewrites its own history. South Park didn't pretend the ManBearPig episodes before season 22 hadn't existed. It lived with them and then answered them. That's not nothing. The equal opportunity rule bent here. It bent toward truth. Not a bad direction to bend in. Eric Cartman is one of the great villains in television history. He is manipulative, racist, genuinely cruel, capable of acts that would be disturbing in a live-action drama and are only slightly less disturbing for being animated. He has manipulated his best friend into eating his own parents. He has fabricated Holocaust survivor status. He has started a hate group. He does not grow. He does not learn. The rule, and it's one of the show's most sacred, is that Cartman is irredeemable, and the comedy of him comes precisely from that irredeemability being total. This rule mostly holds. For nearly 30 seasons, Cartman's fundamental nature remains untouched. And yet, seasons 20 and 21 introduced something the show had never quite attempted, an extended romantic relationship for Cartman. Heidi Turner, a classmate who had previously been a fairly minor character, becomes his girlfriend after a miscommunication about leaving the internet. And for several episodes, more than you'd expect given who Cartman is, the relationship is played with something approaching sincerity. Cartman exhibits, briefly, something that looks like genuine affection. He worries about what Heidi thinks. He adjusts his behavior around her. then the show gradually reveals what this was always going to be. Cartman isn't capable of genuine affection. He begins to resent Heidi, then to manipulate her, then to emotionally abuse her in ways the show depicts with uncomfortable specificity. The relationship arc ends with Heidi realizing she's been turned into a version of Cartman by proximity to him and ending things. It's not a heartwarming story. But for a while, in the early episodes of the arc, there were genuine moments of softness from Cartman that the show had never produced before. Small cracks in the armor, not enough to change who he is, but enough to make you briefly wonder. And then there are the COVID specials. Post-COVID and Return of COVID, which are set 40 years in the future and show adult versions of the boys. The adult Cartman is a rabbi with a wife and children, having built an apparently stable life for himself. This version of Cartman is a mystery in some ways. Has he actually changed, or is this still a performance? The show doesn't entirely commit to an answer. What I find interesting about these moments isn't that they redeem Cartman. They don't. The Heidi arc ends with him reverting entirely. The adult Cartman is too briefly glimpsed to draw conclusions from. But the fact that the show tried these experiments at all, the fact that it tested whether there was anything underneath the irredeemability, says something about how Parker and Stone relate to the character after 30 years. You don't explore these avenues with a character you've completely given up on. There's another angle on the Heidi arc that I think is the more interesting one, actually. The arc isn't really about whether Cartman can change, it's about what being close to Cartman does to a person. Heidi Turner enters the relationship as a thoughtful, self-possessed girl. By the time the arc ends, she has absorbed so many of Cartman's attitudes, his contempt for others, his reflexive victimhood, his way of turning every situation into a grievance, that her friends barely recognize her. The horror of the arc isn't that Cartman did something overtly terrible. It's that proximity to him, over time, reshaped someone who didn't want to be reshaped. That's a fairly complex piece of character writing for a show whose most famous character is permanently 8 years old in moral development. The rule that said Cartman is irredeemable wasn't broken by the Heidi arc. It was reinforced. But it was reinforced by demonstrating the mechanism through which his irredeemability damages people, which is more sophisticated than just showing him doing another bad thing. And I want to say one thing about what this section tells us, coming after everything we've covered. Most television shows have one inviolable character, the character who can't change, can't grow, can't be redeemed, because their unchanging nature is the structural support on which the whole thing rests. The Simpsons has Homer, Arrested Development has Lucille, South Park has Cartman. The temptation, when you've been making a show for 30 years, is to test that support, to see if the character can be something more than the function they serve. Parker and Stone have tested Cartman, carefully and not for very long, and always with the understanding that the test would end and the structure would need to be reinstated. The testing is interesting, the reinstating is necessary. The show seems to understand both halves of that equation, which is rarer than it sounds. The characters don't age rule, a very long time to be 10. Stan Marsh is 9 years old in episode 1 of season 1 of South Park, which aired in August 1997. He turns 10 during the episode You're Getting Old in June 2011. As of this video, he is still, as far as the show is concerned, 10 years old. That's approximately 28 years of television on which a fictional child has been between 9 and 10 years old. It's not the longest stretch of fictional childhood on television. The Simpsons has been going for longer, and Bart Springfield has been 8 or 9 for even longer. But it's genuinely strange to sit with when you think about it directly. A child who was conceived as a 9-year-old in the mid-90s is still that age in 2025, while the people who created him are now in their mid-50s. The rule, no aging permanent childhood, was a practical choice at first. If the boys grew up, the show changed fundamentally. The dynamic that made it work was specifically about childhood. 4 kids navigating a world full of stupid adults, aging them out of childhood would age out the premise. But there was one significant exception, and it happened very early, the transition from 3rd grade to 4th grade during season 4. This was treated as a genuine event within the show's universe. A new classroom, a new teacher, a new theme song. The boys were slightly older, it was acknowledged, and then it stopped happening. 4th grade was apparently the show's final destination. From mid-season 4 through to the present day, the boys have been in 4th grade. This creates occasional oddities when you look closely. The boys were in 4th grade when Barack Obama was elected president, when smartphones became ubiquitous, when social media took over, when a pandemic changed the world. All of it experienced from the perspective of 10-year-olds who were born before any of it existed and haven't aged a day since. There's something in that, I think, that goes beyond the practical rationale. South Park is a show about the present moment, about current events, current anxieties, current cultural absurdities. And the boys are perpetually positioned at the beginning of awareness, perpetually encountering things for what feels like the first time. Keeping them young keeps the show's perspective fresh in a specific way. They see the world without the accumulated cynicism that comes with age. Even when the show is at its most cynical, the boys carry a kind of foundational openness that comes from being, perceptually, always 10. The rule about not aging is really a rule about perspective, and it's held. With one notable near break in the COVID specials, which showed adult versions of the boys and then firmly reset back to childhood. The near break was interesting. The reset was arguably necessary. But I want to spend a moment on the COVID future because it's the most detailed look the show has ever given at what these characters might be like as adults, and it's worth describing. In post-COVID, Stan is a lonely tech worker living in a desolate part of the country, attending therapy sessions and clearly struggling. Kyle is a doctor, conscientious and well-meaning, still essentially the moral center he was as a child. Cartman has improbably become a rabbi with a wife and family. Kenny, and this is the one that stayed with me, is a scientist who won the Nobel Prize for combining dark matter and breast implants, which is exactly the kind of achievement Kenny would accomplish. He's alive, genuinely, continuously alive. No deaths in the 40-year stretch depicted. The curse in this future appears to have lifted somehow, or perhaps Kenny finally found a way to live without provoking it. That detail about future Kenny being alive is never highlighted or explained, it just is. And it's one of those quiet moments where the show rewards close watching, where knowing the mythology of the character makes a background detail resonate. The reset from the COVID future timeline back to childhood was necessary because the show can't permanently be a drama about middle-aged men. But the future they depicted was clearly built with genuine thought about who these characters would become if the time they've been frozen in actually passed. It's not a throwaway. It's the show asking, briefly and seriously, what would happen to these people if they were allowed to grow up? And the answer was specific and considered, and in some cases, quite sad. The boys are still 10, but the people making them have been thinking about what happens after 10 for a long time now. Butters Stotch is one of the most beloved characters in South Park. He's sweet, he's naive, he's endlessly well-meaning, and he gets treated absolutely terribly by everyone around him, which creates the particular comedy of watching someone maintain goodwill toward the world in the face of all evidence. He's the show's heart in a way that's hard to explain without just pointing at him and saying, you know, Butters, he wasn't supposed to exist at all. Look at the background of early South Park episodes. Really look. And you'll find a blonde kid in green and blue standing around with no lines, no name, no particular identity. He's there somewhere between extras and named characters. He's in the background of the pilot. He's in early school scenes. He doesn't matter. Somewhere in seasons 2 and 3, the writers started giving him lines. Small ones, reactions, a couple of actual exchanges. He got a name, Leopold Stotch, going by Butters. He got parents who were characterized as absurdly overreactive about mild misbehavior. He got a nemesis role. The show needed someone to be the victim of the boys' schemes, and Butters, being endlessly trusting and endlessly forgiving, was perfect for it. Then season 5 happened, and Kenny died, and the show needed someone to fill the fourth boy slot. Tweak Tweak was tried first for a handful of episodes. Then Butters stepped in, and the fit was immediately obvious. He was genuinely funny, immediately sympathetic, and his contrast with Cartman in particular created a dynamic that the show mined for years. Cartman manipulative and selfish, Butters naive and good-hearted, the gap between them the engine of multiple plots. By season 6, he was a regular. By season 7, he was getting solo episodes. By season 10 or so, you couldn't really describe him as a supporting character anymore. He had more screen time, more developed plots, and more genuine character depth than most main cast members on other shows. The Professor Chaos Alter Ego. Butters in a cape and horned helmet attempting villainy in ways that never quite work, became its own recurring comedy and revealed something important. Butters was funny not just as a victim, but as an agent, someone with intentions and plans and ambitions, all of which failed because he was, fundamentally, too nice to succeed at being bad. No one decided Butters was going to become this. There was no creative meeting where Parker and Stone said, "Right, this background extra in the green shirt is going to be our 5th main character." It emerged from the work, from the writing room, finding him useful, funny, worth developing, from the audience responding to him, from the show's natural tendency to go where the good material is. The rule that said the show had 4 main characters wasn't formally broken. The show still has 4 main characters. It just also has Butters, who wasn't supposed to be there and has been there for 20 years. There's something in the Butters phenomenon that I find genuinely charming, which is that it happened entirely through the show discovering that he was good. Not through planning, not through market research, not through a network note about diversifying the cast. Just through the writing room repeatedly finding that scenes with Butters worked better than scenes without him. That he could carry plots that the main 4 couldn't. That his specific combination of sweetness and obliviousness created comedy that wasn't available through any other character. The Professor Chaos Alter Ego is worth a little more attention here. When Butters is rejected by the boys, told he can't be in their gang, excluded from whatever adventure they're on, he goes home, puts on a green cape and a horned helmet, and declares himself Professor Chaos, bringer of destruction and doom. His plans for world domination include flooding the world, which fails because a garden hose can't produce enough water. Blocking out the sun, which fails because his cardboard cutout sun blocker is too small. Impersonating a chef, which nobody notices. Professor Chaos is a supervillain who can't do anything. And there's something about the gap between his ambitions and his capability that makes him the perfect expression of Butters as a character. Someone who has been told, implicitly and explicitly, that he doesn't matter and can't do anything right, who has decided to take that assessment and turn it into a villainous persona, and who can't even succeed at that. The comedy isn't mean. It's compassionate. Butters keeps trying, he keeps failing. He doesn't stop being kind. That's not the kind of character you plan in advance. That's the kind you find. Here's a fun detail about making television on a 6-day production cycle. You make mistakes, not always big ones, not always visible ones. But across 28 years and over 300 episodes, a show that writes each episode essentially from scratch and doesn't have a large continuity department has accumulated a considerable archive of small contradictions. Characters whose surnames change mid-run, parents who die and then appear again with no explanation, rules about characters that get applied in one episode and forgotten in the next, minor characters who seem to age forward and backward depending on what the plot requires. South Park has all of these. Butters' father's name was initially different from what it later became. Clyde's mother dies in one episode and is back by a later season. Randy is established as the best scientist in South Park. This is a recurring detail. But later episodes establish other characters in scientific roles that contradict the exclusivity of that. Cartman's fear of needles appears strong in some episodes and is entirely absent in others, which creates a continuity problem with a season 12 episode where he draws blood from his own arm without apparent distress. These are minor. Individually, they don't matter. As a collection, they create a version of the show where continuity is more of a suggestion than a rule, which is honestly consistent with the reset button philosophy. If nothing was ever supposed to stick anyway, why would the small details be expected to? But then there's Tolkien. For 25 seasons of South Park, there was a black student at South Park Elementary named Token Black. The name was obviously, explicitly, a joke. He was the Token Black character, and the show called him that directly and used the joke in various ways across the years. It wasn't a subtle commentary, it was a blunt one. Then, in season 25, episode 2, The Big Fix, the show revealed that the character's name was not Token, it was Tolkien, as in J.R.R. Tolkien, the fantasy author. And everyone had been mispronouncing it for 25 years. The episode made a whole plot out of this, with the boys gradually realizing their mistake and adjusting. Stan particularly struggles with the revelation. Here's the thing about this change. It retroactively reframes 25 years of a joke. Token Black as a name was the show making an explicit, self-aware joke about racial tokenism in television. Token Black as a name is something more interesting. A character whose parents named him after a fantasy author they loved, whose name was misheard and misunderstood by everyone around him for his entire life. It doesn't erase the earlier joke, but it layers something else on top of it. Something with more texture, something that acknowledges the character as a person with a story, rather than a placeholder for a bit. Not a continuity error, that one, a correction of one. And a correction that says something about how the show's relationship to its own material changes across 25 years. But since we're talking about continuity errors more broadly, there's one I want to mention that the show itself made a point of acknowledging, which is the Jerry Borey situation. In season 2, Rick and Morty, wait, wrong show. In season 2 of South Park, there's a brief gag in which Randy and Sharon drop Jerry off at an interdimensional care center for Jerrys from across the multiverse. No, I'm still doing it. Let me try again. In season 2 of South Park, there's an episode called Prehistoric Iceman, with a minor detail that would take many seasons to become relevant. Cartman's cat, Mr. Kitty, is established as male at certain points and female at others, depending entirely on what the episode requires. The show was aware of this inconsistency. It became the subject of a joke in season 12, where the cat's gender is ambiguous enough that nobody can quite commit to a pronoun. Whether that was a deliberate callback to the error or the show independently recreating the same inconsistency isn't clear. Either way, it became a recurring feature rather than a mistake. The cat's gender is whatever it needs to be for the comedy to work. That's a small example of something the show does fairly regularly. It discovers that an inconsistency is actually more useful than consistency would have been. The inability to pin down a minor detail turns out to be funnier or more flexible than having pinned it down in season 1. The error becomes the feature. The continuity problem becomes the running gag. South Park has been doing this for nearly 30 years. The fact that it's still going, still finding these moments, is its own kind of continuity. The only kind the show was ever really committed to. And the Tolkien correction specifically is worth dwelling on a little longer because the way it was handled is genuinely interesting. The episode, The Big Fix, doesn't just have someone announce that the character's name is actually Tolkien. It builds a whole story around the correction. The central argument of the episode is about what it means to have been wrong about something for a long time, and about who's responsible for fixing that wrong. Stan, in particular, has a difficult time with the revelation. He keeps getting the name wrong even after he knows the right name. The muscle memory of 25 years of mispronunciation is hard to override, even when you've accepted that you were wrong. There's something honest in that. A show that had been making a joke about racial tokenism for 25 seasons couldn't just issue a correction and move on cleanly. The episode makes the correction awkward and uncomfortable in precisely the ways that real corrections are awkward and uncomfortable. Stan's struggle with the name change isn't played for cheap laughs at his expense. It's played as a genuine and specific difficulty. The difficulty of changing a habit that was built on an assumption you didn't notice you were making. Whether Parker and Stone intended Tolkien's name to be a secret from the beginning, a long game played across 25 seasons, or whether the retcon was developed in season 25 is something I genuinely don't know. Either version is interesting. If it was always the plan, it's a remarkable piece of patience. If it was developed later, it's a remarkably generous way of revisiting something that could have just been quietly ignored. The character got a name, a real one, with a history and a reference and a set of parents who had a reason for it. That's more than most background characters ever get. South Park, Colorado, population, small. Location, the mountains. Concerns, local, then escalating into absurdity, but always grounded in the geography and social dynamics of one specific American small town. That's the setting. That's the container. However weird things get, they're happening in South Park. And for most of the show's run, this holds. The world comes to South Park rather than the other way around. Celebrities descend on the town, aliens abduct its residents, international crises play out in the school cafeteria. Cosmic entities show up and get dealt with by people who still have to go home for dinner. The show's humor depends partly on the contrast between the scale of what's happening and the smallness of the place it's happening in. But then Season 11 produced the Imagination Land trilogy, and scale stopped being contained. Imagination Land begins with Cartman making a bet with Kyle about the existence of leprechauns. And while this sounds like standard South Park setup, it quickly escalates into something the show had never attempted. Terrorists detonate a bomb in Imagination Land, the realm where all fictional characters exist. The bomb creates a rupture between the good and evil sides of imagination, and an epic war begins. The boys, or mostly Kyle, sent in by the military, have to navigate a full fantasy epic conflict involving characters ranging from the lion, the witch, and the wardrobe inhabitants to horror movie monsters, to every childhood imaginary friend who has ever existed. 3 episodes, real stakes that carry across all 3. A scope and ambition that felt genuinely unusual for South Park. The show was producing something closer to a Lord of the Rings parody than a standard 22-minute comedy. And it worked. The trilogy is widely considered one of the show's peaks, and it won an Emmy when later released as Imagination Land, the movie. The COVID specials took the show somewhere even more unusual, the future. Post-COVID and Return to COVID are set 40 years later, in a world permanently changed by the pandemic. The boys are adults in their 40s. South Park is different. Some characters are dead. The specials are, in their quiet way, the most genuinely emotional things the show has produced in the second half of its run, partly because the future setting gives them permission to take consequences seriously in a way the present tense episodes can't quite manage. These expansions out of South Park proper weren't violations of the spirit of the show. Everything that happens in Imagination Land or the future timeline is still, at its core, about the same characters and concerns. But they required the show to leave the container it had built for itself. To decide for the length of these stories that the smallness wasn't the point, that the point was the characters, and the characters could take their concerns anywhere. What Imagination Land does that's interesting, and this is something I've been thinking about since I first watched those episodes, is that it takes the show's usual satirical register and applies it to fiction itself. All imaginary characters exist in Imagination Land. All of them. Jesus and Superman and Aslan and Strawberry Shortcake and the Woodland Critters from Woodland Critter Christmas and Santa Claus and Gandalf. The bomb that the terrorists detonate releases the evil fictional characters, the horror movie monsters, the malevolent fairy tale figures, and they start overwhelming the good ones. The military sends Kyle into the imaginary realm to fix it. There's something being said there about what fiction does and what it means when the dark stories we tell start to crowd out the hopeful ones. It's not a heavy point, and the show doesn't belabor it. It's too busy having Butters dream his way into Imagination Land and Kyle fighting off Freddy Krueger. But it's there, in the background, the suggestion that the things we imagine matter in ways that aren't entirely metaphorical. The COVID specials are the other major example of the show leaving South Park proper, and they're worth a second look here. The future Colorado of post-COVID isn't played for comedy in the way the show usually handles dystopia. There's real sadness in the world Parker and Stone built for those films, a world permanently altered by a pandemic that lasted decades, where relationships were damaged and never quite repaired, where the boys drifted apart and struggled to find each other again in middle age. The show wasn't making fun of the pandemic exactly, it was processing it, using the specials' longer format and future setting to do something more like mourning than satire, which is, again, not what South Park's geographic and tonal rules were built for. South Park, Colorado was supposed to be the container for everything that happened. The future of South Park is somewhere else entirely. Not a place, but a time. And the tone of those specials is somewhere else entirely too. Not a comedy, really, something quieter and harder to categorize. Whether they work is a matter of taste. I think they do. But the fact that Parker and Stone made them at all, the fact that they took a show that had built its entire identity around a specific place and a specific present tense and made 2 long films set 40 years in the future, says something about what they needed the show to be able to do in 2021. Something the small weekly version couldn't quite hold. For a show that was always supposed to stay in South Park, they've spent a surprisingly significant amount of time finding out what exists just outside it. Let me take a brief pause here before we move into the final few sections. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. The Kenny mythology, the reset button and its most famous failure, the animation breaks, the equal opportunity rule and where it ran into walls, the way Randy quietly became the show's main character while nobody was formally announcing the change, the full serialization experiment and its messy undoing, ManBearPig and the show picking a side, Cartman's occasional and incomplete softness, the characters frozen at 10 forever while their creators aged around them, Butters growing from nothing into something the show couldn't do without, the Tolkien correction, the cosmic expansions beyond the mountain town. That's a lot of broken rules. And we've got a couple more to go. If you're still with me at this point in the evening, truly, I appreciate the company. If you've drifted off and these words are just sound now, that's fine too. There's no test at the end. This is the most recent rule break, and in some ways the most fundamental, because it changes something that had been structurally constant since the very beginning. South Park has always been episodes, 22 minutes, give or take, 10 episodes per season, roughly. Self-contained stories, aired weekly, produced in 6 days. That was the form. The form wasn't just a delivery mechanism, it was built into the show's identity. The 6-day cycle, the episodic structure, the weekly rhythm of a new and different South Park every Wednesday night. And then the pandemic hit. Season 24 was supposed to be a standard season. It wasn't. Instead, Comedy Central and Parker and Stone produced 2 extended specials, the Pandemic Special and the Vaccination Special, each running around 45 minutes to an hour. They weren't episodes in the traditional sense. They were long-form films. The weekly episode structure was gone. The show still existed, but it existed differently. Then came the Paramount Plus era. As part of a deal to bring South Park to the streaming service, Parker and Stone committed to a series of extended feature-length specials, Post-COVID and Return of COVID, feature-length films set in a future pandemic world. The Streaming Wars Part 1 and 2. Joining the Panderverse. Not suitable for children. Each one an hour or longer, each one released as a standalone streaming special rather than a weekly television episode. What this format change does practically is give the show room for story, room for emotional development, room for the kind of slow-building character work that 22 minutes genuinely cannot accommodate. Post-COVID spends its first half hour establishing an entire future world before the plot begins. That wouldn't exist in an episode format. It exists because the film format allows for it. It also, and this is the less comfortable observation, removes some of the spontaneity that made South Park remarkable. The 6-day cycle was possible because episodes were short and self-contained. Producing feature-length films takes longer. The real-time commentary becomes less immediate. The show can still respond to current events, but with a different rhythm than it could when it was making an episode per week. Parker and Stone appear aware of this trade-off. Recent seasons have returned to shorter episode formats alongside the specials, maintaining some of the old rhythm while exploring what the longer form allows. The format rule hasn't been entirely replaced, it's been expanded. The show now operates in multiple formats simultaneously, which is both a sign of the show's continued ambition and an acknowledgement that the world it was designed for, weekly television, 1 episode at a time, has itself changed. There's something interesting about the specials specifically. There was a scene the ones that aired on Paramount Plus rather than Comedy Central. That has to do with who's watching and when. The traditional South Park audience watched weekly, live, or close to live in the context of other things they were watching on that night. The specials are watched on demand, at whatever pace the viewer chooses, on a streaming platform designed for extended viewing sessions. That's a different audience posture, a different kind of attention. And you can feel it in how the specials are paced. They move slower, they let scenes breathe more than episodes typically do. The COVID future films in particular have a quality that feels almost melancholy in places. Not depressed, but ruminative. There are shots in post-COVID of the future South Park that are just visual establishing, mood setting, the kind of thing that would be cut from a 22-minute episode but is allowed to exist in a film. They're doing something different with time. The show that was built on speed has, in its special episode form, learned to slow down. Whether that's a gain or a loss probably depends on what you came to South Park for. I don't think it's a clean answer. The speed and the slowness are both serving the work. They're just serving different work, and the ability to do both, to still produce a sharp 22-minute episode when the material calls for it, and to take an hour and a half when the story needs the room, is maybe the most interesting version of format rule-breaking the show has done, not abandoning the form, expanding alongside it. South Park is, on its face, a show about 4 boys in Colorado. It is not about the television industry. It is not about animated comedy as a form. It is not about the experience of making South Park. The show makes things. It doesn't talk about making things, except it does sometimes, more than you'd think. Cartoon Wars in Season 10 is the clearest example. The 2-part episode begins with the announcement that an upcoming episode of Family Guy will depict the Prophet Muhammad. South Park as a show then becomes the venue for an argument about whether this depiction should happen, with Cartman trying to get Family Guy canceled and Kyle defending its right to broadcast whatever it wants. On the surface, this is a story about free speech and the Muhammad controversy. Underneath it, it's Parker and Stone publicly, transparently making an argument about the difference between their show and Family Guy. Cartman's indictment of Family Guy's writing process, that the show's jokes are generated by manatees pushing idea balls at random, is Parker and Stone's genuine critical position, delivered through a character who's supposed to be the villain of the episode. Kyle defending Family Guy's right to exist while not actually defending its quality is their attempt to be fair. The episode is the show arguing with another show on television in real time. That's genuinely unusual. Most shows don't use their own airtime to position themselves within the broader television landscape. It breaks the fiction in a specific way. Not the fiction of the story, but the fiction that the show exists in its own bubble, independent of the industry that produces it. There's also a recurring element in various episodes where characters reference the absurdity of the show's own structure. Sharon Marsh saying in You're Getting Old that the same things keep happening every week without anything ever changing. The show uses its own characters to comment on its own format, winking at the audience without fully breaking the fourth wall. It's not quite self-referential in the way some shows do it, but it's not quite not that either. The 6 Days to Air documentary, and which aired on Comedy Central in 2011 and showed the behind-the-scenes reality of making a South Park episode in a week, is in some ways the show breaking this rule completely. Not in an episode, but in the real world, showing its production process to an audience who had never seen it. The mystique of how the show got made became part of the show's public identity. The transparency about the process was itself a kind of content. Parker and Stone have always been relatively open about how South Park works, what it's trying to do, where it's failing. That openness is part of the show's personality. A willingness to say, here's what we were going for, here's where we fell short, here's what we think, without needing the show itself to always carry those statements. But the moments when that openness does bleed into the show, when Cartoon Wars criticizes a rival program, when Sharon critiques the reset button, when the show acknowledges its own structure, those are moments when the rule about keeping the production invisible quietly dissolves. No real harm done. If anything, those moments make the show feel more honest about what it is. And since we're talking about meta-awareness, it's worth mentioning the episode You're Getting Old one more time, because it's the most sustained piece of meta-commentary South Park has ever produced that doesn't announce itself as such. Sharon's line about the same things happening every week is the show's own writers reflecting on the reset button from inside the show they created. Randy's admission of long-running unhappiness is, according to Parker's own comments in later interviews, partially autobiographical. The cynicism Stan develops is the creator's cynicism, worn for a season. The whole episode is the show using its own fiction to process what it felt like to keep making the show after 15 years. That's a different kind of meta-awareness from Cartoon Wars. Cartoon Wars was looking outward at the television industry. You're Getting Old was looking inward at what the show was doing to the people who made it. Both broke the same rule. The rule that said South Park is about South Park, not about being a television program, but they broke it in different directions and for different reasons. The fact that a show can sustain both kinds of self-reflection across different seasons and for different purposes is not something you can take for granted. Most long-running shows don't develop enough self-awareness to produce either kind of meta-commentary, let alone both. South Park has been pointing at itself in various ways for most of its run, and it's been better for it. So, that's most of them, not all of them. There are smaller breaks and quieter violations scattered throughout 28 seasons that could keep us going for hours more, and maybe someday we'll do exactly that. But the major ones are here. The Kenny rule and the mythology that grew underneath it. The reset button and the night it didn't press cleanly. The animation that became anime, became machinima, became rotoscoping, became a storybook. The equal opportunity principle that ran into a wall it hadn't chosen. Randy Marsh quietly becoming the main character of a show that wasn't supposed to have main characters. What I come back to when I think about all of this is that none of these breaks made South Park less itself. If anything, the opposite. A show that never changed its rules would have stayed exactly what it was in 1997. Crude, funny, fast, occasionally brilliant, and eventually probably exhausted by its own formula. The rules broke because the show grew, because Parker and Stone found things more interesting than the rules, because a character like Butters turned out to be worth developing, and a character like Kenny turned out to have a mythology worth excavating, and a concept like ManBearPig turned out to have something true at the bottom of it that the joke couldn't contain forever. The rules were never the point. The show was the point. And a show that's willing to look at its own rulebook and say, this one isn't serving us anymore, let's see what's on the other side of it. That's a show that has some chance of still being interesting at age 28. Which South Park improbably still is, and I think the reason it still is, or at least one of the reasons, is that every time the show broke a rule, it broke it for a reason. Not out of boredom, not out of carelessness, not because someone forgot the rule existed, because the story required something the rule couldn't provide, because a character had grown into something the rule couldn't contain, because the world had changed in a way that made an old position no longer honest. There's a coherence to the rule breaking when you lay it all out like this. It tells you what the show values underneath the chaos. It values honesty over consistency. It values character over formula. It values following the material wherever it goes over defending a position that stopped being true. These aren't small things. Most shows, especially long-running ones, value the opposite. Consistency, formula, the comfort of established positions that the audience already knows. South Park chose the harder thing, repeatedly over nearly 30 years, not always successfully. Season 20 is a good argument for the value of some rules. The show's occasional over-reliance on Randy in the Tegrity era is a good argument for the value of the boys at the center principle. Rules exist for reasons, and breaking them reveals the reasons. But even the missteps were committed missteps. The show was wrong about something it had genuinely decided to try. That's the right kind of wrong. And there's one more observation I want to leave you with, which I think is maybe the most important one. South Park has been renewed through 2029 and 2030. Parker and Stone will, if they hold to that commitment, have been making the show for over 30 years by the time the final episode airs. Assuming there is a final episode and not just an ongoing series that continues indefinitely until one of them decides it's done. 30 years is a long time to make anything. It's a long time to maintain a set of creative rules about what your thing is and what it isn't. Most things that last that long do so by becoming comfortable and familiar and somewhat predictable, by leaning into what they know works. South Park has occasionally done that in the seasons where the formula felt tired. But the best of its later years and the most interesting parts of the rule-breaking we've been cataloging tonight are the opposite of comfortable. They're a show that keeps looking at itself with fresh eyes, asking whether what it's doing is still the right thing to do, and changing course when the answer is no. That quality is genuinely rare. And it's probably the reason that a show about 4 foul-mouthed children in a small Colorado mountain town, started by 2 men in their late 20s using construction paper and a bit of anarchic ambition, is still going strong nearly 3 decades later and still producing episodes that people find worth talking about. The rules it made for itself were good rules. The times it broke them were even better. Sleep well.